question button or raise your hand either way. All right?
So
Ginger, Wally?
this is it on? Woo. Yep. Okay. This is our state of play. Wally gets the hard questions. He's already agreed to this. I get the easy questions. So that's our state of play. Before I get started, when we had our last executive committee meeting, you all had just found out about the Red River bankruptcy, right? And you asked me to find out more information. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact on Monday you received a quarterly report from Metro Water, and it does address that in there. So I didn't want you to think I hadn't addressed it. It does say in there that the restructuring specialist basically commits to continue that contract and the services with trash pickup. So I just wanted, that was an unfinished business that I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget to tell you, but it came in your email box on Monday. So special session started at Wednesday at 4 o'clock, ended Saturday morning at about 1:30, and about 6 bills passed that affect us, 4 mainly. Dozens and dozens of bills were passed. The only ones that really, dozens and dozens of bills were filed, only bills that were sponsored by House and Senate leaders were the ones that actually passed. As of about 2 hours ago, I looked to see if any of them had been signed by the governor, and unless it's been the last couple hours, I had not seen that any had been signed by him as yet. He has 10 days to sign that. Some of them went to him on Monday, some of them went to him on Tuesday. So I think he has a few more days to decide on that. I'm going to cover a couple of easy ones first, and then the 2 big ones together. The first easy one relates to our district attorney and all district attorneys. If a district attorney categorically refuses to prosecute all instances of a criminal offense without regards to facts or circumstance, then the state attorney general can ask the state Supreme Court to basically appoint a district attorney pro tem to prosecute those crimes. So we had that instance in Davidson County, and now we have a law dealing with that. The other small piece of legislation that passed relates to school board elections. There now is a provision for partisan school board primaries. Basically, the local party can ask for a partisan primary. If a party asks for it, then it is going to be a partisan primary. So it doesn't have to be both, just one can ask. In that circumstance, the party can nominate someone and say, this is our Democratic pick, this is our Republican pick, or a candidate can say, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican running. If the individual running does not want to identify with one party or another, the floor debate said that individual will be listed on the ballot as an independent. That's not in the law, but that was the floor description of what would happen. It also puts into statute when the election will happen. Typically, we have school board elections in August. So it says that the first Tuesday in May will basically be that primary day. So those are the easy ones. The more complicated ones were kind of called the omnibus bill and the health department bill. I'm going to lump these together and really talk about it by subject, and this is going to get a little dense, so I'm sure you'll have questions. The first piece deals with executive orders and health directives. In statute, we had not really had clarity on when does a pandemic start and when does it end. So now we have a statute that tells us when it starts. And it starts when the World Health Organization says we have a pandemic, and then the governor issues a state of emergency and says we're in a state of emergency because of a pandemic. So clearly in law now it says this is when a pandemic starts. A pandemic ends when that state of emergency issued by the governor either expires or he basically says it's over and withdraws that emergency order. The reason that's important is because in the statute now, when there is a pandemic, certain things and authorities change. So when there is a pandemic and a state of an emergency, the governor has exclusive authority to issue executive orders and health directives in that circumstance. In that same circumstance during a pandemic, the governor's orders and directives supersede any directive or order issued by a health department, a local health board, a county mayor, or other officials. So in that circumstance, governor's directives rule. How long those directives and executive orders was also a statutory change. Those orders lasted for 60 days previously. Now they will only last 45 days. At the end of that 45 day, it can expire and a governor can renew his order in 45 days, but they will no longer last 60 days. And in fact, we were looking today, there are 2 orders that expire this week, November 5th. When we're not in a pandemic state of emergency, the mayor, in consultation with the director of health, may establish rules and regulations as are necessary or appropriate to protect the general health and safety of the county. So that was sort of a clear provision that is perceived a little bit as new authority for the mayor. We expect in conversations with the Department of Health that we had over the weekend that there will be some cleanup legislation in regular session because some of the legislation that passed is a little bit confusing around rules and regulations and who has authority when within the health department and the mayor and the state. So they've already said they anticipate coming back with a cleanup piece of legislation, and we'll be watching that closely and having conversations with them. Is there anything on that you want to chime in?
I don't think so.
Okay. Not a hard question yet. Quarantine. The legislation establishes that the state commissioner of health is the only individual that may establish quarantine guidelines that are applied to a person or as it relates to the closure of a school or a private business. There was a lot of floor discussion about, is the commissioner of health going to individually say, you're quarantined, you're quarantined, you're quarantined across the state. What the floor debate said is, no, the commissioner really is going to establish the guidelines, and then that is how we will deal with quarantine situation. Vaccinations. Governmental entities, public schools, local education agencies are prohibited from mandating a person receive a vaccine. Entertainment venues, there was a lot of discussion around that, and as Music City, there were some specific provisions as it relates to entertainment venues. A venue may say you can show a negative COVID vaccine, you can show that you have antibodies, or you can voluntarily show that you have received a vaccine to gain access. What that change means is a venue can't say, we have to only see proof of vaccination to get in. And some of that has already changed with Nashville venues just in the last 3 days. I heard a change in a radio commercial on Sunday. You noted today that Bridgestone Arena just came up with some new policies. So that message is getting out, and that is going to change.
This afternoon, I got an email from Bridgestone announcing a change in their policy. I've got season tickets to the Predators, and I had to download the Clear app and put my vaccination card information in there and then show that on my way in to Predators games. You could also show proof of a negative test within 72 hours. But Bridgestone announced this afternoon that except for events where the sponsor, such as CMA, is still insisting on that protocol, they are dropping all of their entry requirements concerning vaccination or testing. So the next Predators home game, there will be no need to show any proof of anything other than your ticket to get in the door. There are events like CMA where they're still abiding by that protocol.
So let's get the masks that we're all wearing right now. Statute prohibits governmental entities from requiring that employees or members of the public wear a mask to enter the facilities or to receive governmental services. There are provisions for when an entity can have a mask mandate. And that's when the governor has a state of emergency declared for COVID-19. And then there's this health threshold. And the health threshold is when there's a 14-day rolling average of positive infections of 1,000 per 100,000 people. So basically 1%. And if the governor has the state of emergency for COVID and there is a threshold, then it allows a governmental entity to have a mask mandate. But that mask mandate can only last for 14 days. And then the next 14 days, you have to look and see if that health threshold still exists or does not. That is true also for schools, but the process of a school getting a mask mandate, there's some additional steps the school has to do. A school principal in that instance has to request in writing to the school board that a mask mandate has been put in place. The school board has to take that request and look at it school by school by school and make a decision. They are no longer allowed to say, system-wide, we're going to have a mask mandate. They are under the same sort of requirements of the health threshold. Their mandate can only last 14 days, just like governments are. If a local education agency institutes a mask mandate outside of this statute, state funds can be withheld. After a lot of discussion and lobbying by various parties, there were several exemptions that were added at the very last minute. So I'm going to sort of rattle off exemptions. State prisons and local jails, they can have masks. Airports, there's an FAA requirement. Airports are exempt. You're going to still need to wear your mask when you go to BNA. Healthcare providers that are certified by Medicare or Medicaid are exempt. Healthcare providers that are enrolled in Medicare or Medicaid and are subject to fines over federal rules and regs are exempt. Assisted care living facilities, homes for the aged, nursing homes, residential hospice, exempt. Federally owned or operated property, if there are federal requirements, and contrary to this law, they're also exempt. Individuals may be exempt from mask if they say they have a medical or a religious objection.
In terms of exemptions also, Ginger touched on this briefly, but the definition of school for purposes of this omnibus bill includes only public schools and public school charters. It does not include private schools. So private schools would continue to have the ability to mandate masks for their students and teachers.
That's a very good distinction. There is also a process set up for employers to go to the state comptroller. So in this statute, the comptroller was given authority to basically take requests for exemption. He has to establish a process for doing that. But essentially, a school, an employer, a governmental entity, if we are at risk of losing federal funds because we are not complying with some requirements, say mask or vaccinations, we can go to the comptroller and ask for an exemption, and then he can issue an exemption for a certain period of time. So I think I would anticipate, and Wally can probably talk in more detail, we're going to need to go through a process internally within Metro and figure out where that applies and where it does not apply today, and then where that may apply once we get the guidance from the federal level around employers that employ over 100 people have a vaccine mandate. So there's sort of where are we today, and then where will we be in the future when we might have a direct conflict between federal law and state law.
And to that point, media reports this week are indicating the presidential vaccination mandate, the regs for that may come out as soon as the end of this week. So we may have this federal law, state law conflict issue teed up almost as soon as this bill becomes effective if the governor signs it.
The good news is Wally and his team are not going to be without any work. They're going to have plenty of work to do interpreting where there might be conflict. There were provisions around unemployment insurance and adverse action. So there were provisions in here that if someone is fired because they didn't get a vaccine, that they can get unemployment insurance. I don't know that that has been the case anywhere in Metro, but they can also retroactively go back and get unemployment insurance at the point at which they were let go or had action. It also says that a governmental entity, a school or LEA or private business can't take adverse action against someone if, for example, they're not going to show proof of a vaccination or they're unwilling to wear a mask. And then it kind of gives this list of what adverse action could be. That could be losing your job. It could be not getting a promotion. It could not getting a benefit or a service. There's a whole laundry list of what adverse action is and that you're not allowed to do that to anyone. There are also special provisions in here around healthcare providers. There were some healthcare providers that were having action taken against them for providing monoclonal antibodies and other things like that that might have been outside of healthcare protocols. There is protection for them. There is also a statutory provision that probably more directly affects us, which is that a parent or guardian must have written consent before administering a COVID vaccine to a minor. So that will affect, making sure at Lynn's Health Center or our pop-up sites or the school system announced today rolling out vaccine sites. They already put in provisions when they'd made that announcement today that a parent has to or guardian has to be present. They have to give permission. So they're already following these new requirements. Liability. There is some liability protection that was passed in legislation for employers in the spring that was restated in the omnibus bill around if somebody dies or something as it relates to COVID, that there are liability protections unless there's gross negligence or willful conduct. That's repeated in here. There's a tricky part, and Wally can probably talk about this a little bit more than I can, that relates to the use of governmental funds. State and local funds cannot be used to implement any new federal regulation regarding master vaccines for COVID, and it specifically prohibits using state funds, personnel, or property, or local government personnel, funds, or property to implement, regulate, or enforce any federal law, executive order, rule, or regulation that imposes requirements related to masking and vaccinations. It doesn't apply to anything in effect like right now. It's future. And that's kind of looking at these federal regs that are going to come is going to set up a lot of conversation and investigation, I think. And
we'll just have to wait and see. It's clear that some things that are in effect now, like the FAA and TSA regs on the airport authority to mandate masks there, that stays. And the airport authority can use state or local funds to enforce those. But any new mandates that come from the federal government, for instance, if there is a vaccine mandate that does apply to local governments, then what this law says is that Metro cannot use state or local funds to enforce the federal vaccine. It was listed as an item under the anti-commandeering section of the statute, where in the minds of the legislature, the federal government would be commandeering local or state funds to provide for a mechanism to enforce a new federal edict. So by implication, they're saying if the feds are going to make you do it and you in fact have to do it, then the federal government's going to have to pay for it because you can't use any state or local money to do it. And again, a lot of what I'm here to say today is there are a lot of things here that we just have to wait and see how they play out, and that's one of them.
There's one last piece that relates to the right of legal action, and it puts in statute that an individual can bring legal action against a public or private entity to get injunctive relief, recover compensatory damages and attorney fees if the public or private entity violates any provisions of the bill related to wearing masks or receipt verification of vaccination. There are certain parts of what I described that expire July 1 of 2023. I think the assumption that was made by the legislature is that some of this will not be relevant anymore by then, that by 2023 it will go away. So that was a lot to digest.
Okay.
I see questions.
Councilmember Mendez, I saw your hand up first. Go ahead.
Thanks, y'all, for the update. I just wanted to provide a little context for the letter that a lot of us signed and sent to the mayor on Monday, and then ask a couple questions. First of all, not directed at anybody at this building, but what happened last week, culminating in the legislation, was really, truly outrageous, alarming, the single biggest paring back of local authority, I think probably ever. Just really dramatic changes that, as evidenced by y'all's comments, are far-reaching and hard to get your hands around in just a couple of days. And so the initial, you guys didn't get the first draft of the letter. You had to work through a couple drafts that were just basically mad about the state doing this to us. And ultimately, the letter came down to asking for a full report about all the various implications and a plan of action. And obviously, you guys are working on it. In the letter, it asked for a report in 14 days because it was clear it was going to take some time to get a handle on it. And I'm going to take the liberty of speaking on behalf of the folks that signed it. Maybe I'll hear I'm wrong about this, but this is obviously a work in progress. I think we would like a report at 14 days, even if it was to say, here are the known knowns and here's some stuff we're still trying to figure out the implications of, because I think it still will be a work in progress in 14 days. But one of the major goals here is to not do business like the state of Tennessee has done business, where they got together and in a bum's rush, a lot of closed doors meeting, a lot of secrecy about what it all means, poor draftsmanship, just throws the economic engine of the state into sort of a scramble to figure it out. We, on the other hand, whatever this deliberative process is, as you guys try to figure it out on behalf of the 700,000 citizens of Davidson County, getting us firm written reports about here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what's next, I think, at least from my perspective, would be appreciated. If y'all needed us to put that in a non-binding resolution, I'm sure we could do that. I bet we don't need to. And so again, on behalf of the citizens of Davidson County, I'm not going to go on and on and on about the outrage of the paring back and the carving back of our local control. But I want to express that generally, and thank you for all your efforts. I hate that so many city resources are thrown into figuring out what the heck they did to us with this legislation instead of going about the daily business of our city. So thank you for all the efforts, and looking forward to that first report. Thank you.
I'd like to say in response to that, thank you, Councilmember Mendez, for your letter. It had some good points in it. There are topics that were specifically delineated in the letter, and we are working on that. I can assure you we will give you a full written report. I can also assure you that I will be available, Ginger will be available if we need to come back before this committee or the council as a whole to discuss it any further. We are certainly able to do that. This has obviously been the most pressing issue on this council's agenda, on the mayor's agenda. And in fact, I've been in my position now for 4 months. The biggest surprise is how much time I have personally had to spend on mask wars, COVID emergency orders, who has what authority under what law, because I was hopeful that we had passed that, but apparently we have not passed that. And it is taking a lot of our time, but it is the most important issue that we have. It's the health and safety of the citizens of Metropolitan Nashville. So we are obviously taking it very seriously. We'll give you that report. If you have follow-up questions, we will be available. I do appreciate the 14-day period because it will take some time for us to complete our analysis. And there may be some additional things that happen externally, such as federal mandates, that may even cause us to need more time on certain pieces of it. But we will get you a written report. So thank you
very much.
And I would say this is evolving as I'm talking to various groups who they're all doing interpretation right now. That there will be things even after we give you a written report that, oh, some association has found this clause. They're now talking to the state agency on interpretation. This is going to be evolving, and so the first report may not, it'll give you where we are at that state of play, but it may be evolving over the course of the next, 6 months or so.
Councilmember Hancock was next.
So I came into this meeting with one question, but now I have 3 more. So my first one is more of a clarification. You mentioned that he has 10 days to sign. So I read that 10 days does not count Sundays, but it does count Saturdays. So his 10th day would be Thursday the 11th. Is that your understanding?
I was at a Tennessee Municipal League board meeting earlier today, and they interpreted it the same way.
And then he also has those 10 days to veto, although that's probably not likely, but he also could not sign, and after 10 days, it would just go into effect. Is that correct?
I believe that's my understanding as well.
And then my major question and my major concern, and the reason I signed on to this letter, was our health director, because, what I read was that when you need to appoint a health director, the mayor gets to provide 3 options, and the state gets to either select one of those 3 or select anyone else in the world and just provide a letter explaining why. So would that happen immediately? Would our health director need to leave, or would that be if this position becomes available? My second question is, you mentioned the state of emergency. Is that only pertaining to this health crisis pandemic? Like we had a racial unrest last May and we were able to declare a state of emergency in the city. Would we be able to do that? My third question, you mentioned a parent or guardian must provide written consent. Previously, they would have had to do that anyway until the age of 16 in the state of Tennessee, and then from age 16 on, the children could get it anyway. Is that still the same?
I'll take the easy one, the last one. Yes. Your last question is the easier one, where you said 16 and above. There was concern about that by legislators, so now if you are a minor, you have to have a parent or guardian written consent. That is a change. There was a great deal of discussion over the past couple months by the legislature around teenagers basically getting a small number of teenagers getting vaccines, and they perceived that without parent consent, including the state commissioner of health wasn't there when some of her children got vaccinated.
So would that change all vaccines or just COVID?
I believe it's just COVID, right?
as far as the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, I think we believe it's just COVID.
On your first question, that's actually one of the more complicated provisions of this new legislation. There is a very long history of the Metro Health Department. The first private act goes back to 1905, so 116 years ago. The charter was in place in 1963, establishing the Metro Health Department. And there are competing references in state law for public health departments that exempt health departments in existence as of 1985. So we're looking at this really hard to see whether or not the appointment process has in fact changed. We do not have a definitive answer on that right now. I can tell you it's not clear to us that the appointment process for Metro has changed. But we're looking into that. And I'm sorry, what was your
The state
second
of
question?
emergency, when we declared a state of emergency in May of, what year was that? 2020? Because of the attack on the courthouse and the racial unrest, would we still be able to do that, or would we need the state to do that?
Just related to the pandemic, right?
Right.
Yes, you could still do that. This is just related to the World Health Organization says we're in a pandemic. The governor says we're in a state of emergency with the pandemic. Then all this stuff applies, right?
Thank you.
And it's clear the emergency powers that local governments had outside of a pandemic remain in place unaffected by this legislation.
Okay. Councilmember Evans.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I have one question. I wanted to go back to your description of the kind of setting the governor's orderability with the World Health Organization. So you said that when the pandemic starts when the World Health Organization says there's a pandemic, it ends when the governor says it's over. Is there any connection back to the World Health Organization? So literally they can make an arbitrary decision, pandemic is done. Or is there any connection to science?
The governor gets to decide.
Okay, very good.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Parker.
Thank you, Vice Mayor, and thank you all for being here. I wanted to hopefully get just a little bit of clarification about the special DA legislation. So, my understanding has always been that we, we don't enforce every law in the books, and that the ones that we do choose to enforce with public resources is largely a matter of discretion. And so my question, things that traditionally don't get as much enforcement priority, say wage theft or something of that nature. If a constituent of mine calls me and says, hey, my employer's been stealing my wages, and Glenn Funk's office or whatever DA's office, won't do anything about it, how do I initiate that process of saying, hey, we need the state to appoint prosecutor in this case because the local prosecutor won't do anything about it? And then would that prosecutor be required to pursue that case, or would they simply consider pursuing that case?
On the last question, the appointed prosecutor pro tem would be charged with considering whether to bring a case. And that provision is triggered by a declaration of a local DA that for a certain category of cases, under no circumstance will he or she bring a prosecution. So as long as the local DA says, I'm going to review cases on a case-by-case basis, and of course I need to prioritize matters based on level of urgencies, then we do not believe the statute is triggered. But a lot of these questions will be up here in Nashville to General Funk, how he decides to go forward if this legislation is enacted.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, if I'm the DA and I'm not making certain statements to the media, this is essentially about whether a DA has made public statements regarding a category of offense. Is that so? It wouldn't.
It says categorically refuses to prosecute in all instances a certain criminal offense without regard to facts or circumstances. So there was some discussion on the floor about, does it have to be a declaration, to your point, right? That's the easiest way. If somebody says, I'm not going to prosecute that, I don't care what anybody says, then that's clearly a categorical statement. If there's a pattern of behavior, there was some discussion on the floor around, well, what if somebody doesn't say it? They just never prosecute it. And I think that's where it's maybe a little gray. Could a state attorney general ask for a pro tem DA because they see that in 10 years a DA has never prosecuted a single type of case of a certain type? I believe they have that authority to do that. It would just take a lot more legwork to be able to prove that they've never prosecuted a certain type of crime. Is that sort of accurate?
I think there's an open question about that. That's
Okay.
a logical interpretation here. But if the DA does not say, I am announcing to the citizens of Nashville that I will never bring a prosecution for this particular criminal offense, then that triggers the statute. Anything short of that, it would be open to interpretation. Somebody who wants to complain about the DA not prosecuting instances of criminal conduct could go to the Tennessee Attorney General and raise that complaint there. The Tennessee Attorney General would then review it, and if he or she felt like it was appropriate, could petition the Supreme Court. So the avenue for somebody to protest or to raise concerns about the actions of the local DA would be to communicate directly to Tennessee's Attorney General.
Thank you. That answers my question. Thank you all.
Okay. Councilmember Porterfield.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, even though I'm not on the committee. My question was with regards to local schools having the ability to require vaccinations. Currently, Hep B, MMR are vaccinations that are required prior to entering kindergarten. Kids have to get the booster shots when they are going into 7th grade. Is this legislation now banning all vaccinations, or is this specifically for the COVID-19 vaccination? Similar to Councilmember Hancock's question, but a little bit different.
Just this one. Now, the piece that I forgot to cover is around this ADA issue, which gets really complex, and I don't know if you want to say anything about
Sure.
that piece.
That's the other most complicated aspect of this legislation is the local school authorities, because right now, first, Ginger's right, the new legislation applies only to the COVID vaccination, not to any of the other vaccinations that are mandated to attend public schools. So it's only for COVID. Secondarily, there are federal court decisions in each of the 3 federal districts enjoining Governor Lee's executive order that provided for parents to have the right to opt out of local school mask mandates. So those were county specific, but it was each federal court division of Tennessee, East, Middle, and West. And so there are multiple layers of complication when it gets to the school mask issue. You've got the ADA litigation that's ongoing, and there may be new cases. You've got federal regulations in connection with school buses, and you also have some regulations in connection with American Rescue Plan funds for local schools. So I would say that is an area that's going to need some time to do a thorough analysis. And I know from my conversations with the local schools that MNPS is taking a deep dive into this right now to review what their policies should be if this legislation becomes law.
Councilmember Porterfield, anything else? Okay. Councilmember Sepulveda.
Thank you, Vice Mayor, for recognizing me, even though I'm not on this committee. And Councilmember Mendez left, but I did want to thank him for putting that letter together so quickly. I'm a little concerned because I know that some of this takes time to process and figure out, and I understand the waiting, but I want to make sure that we don't wait too long, because potentially when this goes into effect, we're going to be in a very dangerous place. Following the state guidelines and how they've operated has gotten people, they're dead, obviously because of COVID and how the state has approached COVID. So I want to make sure that litigation isn't off the table. I know that many times we try and walk back the possibility of going to court with the state, and we're always so afraid of that, and no one wants to go into court for reasons, like this. But it still needs to be on the table because we're heading down a very dangerous path, which means our attorney general, the way our schools are approaching this, there are young children who still can't get the vaccine because they're not of age. So I know that there's other cities who are talking about the possibility of doing this. I just want to make sure that if it comes to it, and if we need the courts to give us a better guidance as to what we can and can't do, that isn't off the table.
Well, I'd say we're 3 business days into analyzing this. It hasn't become law yet. To my knowledge, nothing is off the table. I would like to point out that Metropolitan Nashville has sued the state of Tennessee over school vouchers, and we are awaiting an opinion from the Tennessee Supreme Court on that, and Metropolitan Nashville has won at every level of the courts so far. Metropolitan Nashville has sued the state over the BEP formula for funding public schools, saying that the level of funding is constitutionally inadequate. So I guess I would say that Metropolitan Nashville has not been timid about suing the state of Tennessee on matters where they believe there is a very strong case to be made that the state action is inappropriate. That said, some of these things are clearer than others. The public school situation is as complicated as it can be, and it's unclear what the schools will decide to do in reaction to this legislation. And there are various options on the table for them. Some of these changes in the statute are changes to statutory provisions in connection with who has emergency powers. And so far, the history of the granting of those historical emergency powers has been simply a matter of state law that can be amended from time to time. There has been no legislation that has been challenged on the basis of the Tennessee Constitution or the U.S. Constitution regarding who has what emergency powers. I'm not saying that there's no chance of that, but in certain areas of this regulation, it simply is a matter of state law. And the legislature has the ability to change state law, and the governor has the ability to sign it or veto it or let it become law without his signature. So we're looking at every single aspect of this to see what legal claims Metro may have against the state. So nothing's off the table, but we're also not going to bring a lawsuit that we believe doesn't have legal validity.
I appreciate that. There have been instances in the past, worker safety being one of them for several past administrations now. So I do appreciate that. I understand it's been 3 days. That's why I signed on to Councilmember Mendez's letter about 14 days and having a plan come to us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Welsh.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. I do want to echo Councilmember Sepulveda's call for a sense of urgency with this, because it is so easy to lose that sense of urgency, and Nashville is so uniquely positioned to have an increase in infection and variants of this virus, just given the nature of our economy, the tourism, our increased density as it applies to all these areas around us with less density, that we have so many visitors constantly to the city. But my question for you, and you may not know the answer to this, is if the governor does unilaterally decide that a pandemic is over, does that preclude the ability to petition the comptroller for relief and ask to be able to continue some of these measures? Or since the pandemic is no longer
Oh, that's a good question.
in happening,
Do it,
we cannot do that, and we just have to go along with no precautions at all because there is no pandemic to have precautions for?
That's a great question, and I think we both agree that those are two separate things. So let's say the governor's executive orders expire on November 5th. There is still this provision in statute that if federal funds are at risk, you can petition the comptroller for exemption from pieces of the statute. And no, we're in communication with state agencies. We've been in communication with the comptroller. So just since Saturday morning, we're in communication.
I want to say that Ginger and I have been working on this literally around the clock. I got an email from Ginger at 1 in the morning, Sunday morning, where she sent me her draft of this analysis. Metro Legal has been working all weekend and all this week on this legislation, advising the mayor's office about it, talking with the Metropolitan Department of Health about it and the impact that it has on the citizens of and residents of Davidson County. So you're getting no disagreement from anybody I know in Metro that this is an urgent matter that requires immediate attention. And so that's the only assurance I can give you is we are working on it as hard and as quickly as we can.
Councilmember Welsh, anything else? Okay. Councilmember Hauser.
Thank you for recognizing me. The question that comes to my mind is, I know we keep talking about all this legislation in reference to this current pandemic of COVID, but one of my concerns is this the slippery slope that then can bleed over, such as the state's control of our schools? If this stands, does that just open the door for more state takeover of our local government and of our local schools?
Is that a hard one? That's a hard one.
The short answer is we don't know. It's unclear whether this is the beginning of a process that will be revisited in the legislature when they come back in January. I know that the legislature right now has two relatively urgent priorities on their agenda already. One is taking a look at the BEP formula, and the other is they have to do their redistricting for their own seats in the House and the Senate. So they've got a fairly full plate. It's also an election year next year for the governor and everybody in the state house and half of the state senate. And so we don't anticipate that they will be wanting to have an extended session next year, but I think it's just too soon to predict whether or not they will be looking to make other changes to the relative powers of state government versus local governments.
Councilmember Hauser, anything else?
No, that doesn't. That's just one of the alarms that kind of goes off for me is if this stands, then does that just mean, oh, now it's easier to get other things through?
All right. Anybody else with questions on this?
So the last quick thing, and you guys have been so patient, is where we are with the RFP on a state lobbyist. So the current, the contract we had with the firm was set to expire in December. That's a really weird time to sort of start an RFP process when the legislature is right around the corner. So we ended that contract a few months early. Late September, I believe, we went out with an RFP for a new state lobbyist. It had provisions in that RFP to provide the council a written report. That was at your request. That RFP closed in early October. We received 3 vendor applications. We have conducted the written evaluation. We conducted interviews just last week. We have done that evaluation. Metro Procurement does the diversity and price scoring. That has all been provided to procurement. You've had a representative on that selection committee. Vice Mayor Schulman was on that. Wally is on that, I'm on that, and the deputy mayor. So we have agreed on our scores. We've provided that to procurement. Procurement is working through the process of giving an award with the intent that sooner is better for me, so I can begin working with them on strategy and agenda. So that's kind of where we are. Yes.
Excuse me. Are we able to know who the finalists are?
Neither one of us know if that is public information at this point or not.
If it is public and we determine that tomorrow, we'll let you know. How's that?
Thank you.
What I don't want to do is mess up anything in the procurement process.
That's why we're being very careful.
Understood.
And then I have to start over. So, our intent is we get this awarded pretty quickly. The vice mayor and I have talked about ways to make sure that you are kept informed beyond the report. And one thing that I know you're talking about is having this executive committee meeting on a regular basis, perhaps monthly. And this may be a good venue when the legislature's in session, that there's just a legislative update, at this executive committee meeting. So that's something we've talked about. If that's what you choose, is a good way to sort of keep you informed on what's going on. And that's my update.
Councilmember Henderson.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Andrew, in that same spirit, I think I would say, the previous lobbyist did have kind of a standard report, but there are those of us who have done some, pretty significant legislation, especially in the Title 17 space, our sidewalk regs and otherwise, and there's always sort of the looming caption bill, right, that the state will come and preempt our ability. And so, I kind of have this constant fear and wonder of, what's coming up for that and how are we going to get ahead of that and defend that. And so I think what I'm hoping for is just kind of proactively, we know those spaces in which historically we have thought that there is an effort toward preemption, and that, it wouldn't have to be me checking in with you, where are we, reading the weekly report to make sure that I just need to know that somebody is intentionally watching that, and then they will let me know if we're concerned about that. So, and I'm sure that's true for other colleagues in the affordable housing space, all the various places where we've historically, where there's a pattern of preemption, and just, for whatever that, bill was, or those particular co-sponsors or the people that worked on that legislation, just kind of proactively being in touch with those folks would be helpful. I mean, short-term rental previously, et cetera. So thank you.
Sure. And one thing the vice mayor and I have talked about is, are there ways in which certain individual council members who may have deep knowledge on a subject or may have deep relationships on the Hill, is there a way from a strategy perspective that can be helpful? So we'll continue to talk about that once we have a lobbyist to figure out. There might be times when we call upon you and say, hey, do you mind helping us with this when it's appropriate?
Councilmember Henderson, something else?
I appreciate that. And then I think as well, in the same vein, building on what you're saying, so there's policy that we've passed, right? And then policy that we anticipate, whether it be sidewalk robots, et cetera, things like that we kind of see coming down the pike that we know intersects a policy space that this body cares about. I think that's another kind of on the proactive side. So one sort of a defensive posture, hopefully, being as proactive as we can, and then also just looking at national trends, right, where certain corporations go first to the state legislature to get them to preempt local government so that they can implement something that advances their business interest. Like I really am hoping we can be proactive about that, because so often it's just that a certain corporation is controlling the narrative at the state level before we're even aware of it, and then we are too far behind to reframe the conversation but to the benefit of the city and the citizens. So thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just add one thing, we have had conversations with all of our candidates about being proactive, about looking for instances. Councilmember Sepulveda mentioned the Get It Right bill on worker safety, where this council enacted legislation and it was almost immediately overruled by state statute, or at least arguably overruled. So we have been working with our candidates to impress upon them that they need to be able to tap into the resources here on these topics where you do have expertise, and put our best case in front of the legislature. So if they still do things to take away our authority or to override essentially our legislative initiatives, at least we have put our best face, our best argument in front of them before they do that.
Councilmember Henderson.
And to that end, Mr. Dietz, I guess my last question suggestion would be, and Ginger, this may be particular to your work, some of the Vice Mayor and I have spoken about before, a lot of our ring counties and cities are having kind of big city problems, right? So your Murfreesboro's, your Clarksville's, your other cities. And so I think so often we're in a very awkward posture related to preemption because we are positioned as, big bad blue over regulatory Nashville. And I think whether through TML or otherwise, there are a whole lot of other cities in the state of Tennessee who do not want the state legislature to take away their ability to require sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think building those strategic alliances with our peer cities that are, not necessarily just always the default big four, right? I think there are other cities, we see with City of Franklin and otherwise. I mean, we have a lot of policy goals that are similar, trees, sidewalks, things like that. And so I think when we can go to the legislature and say, hey, these red counties, these red cities, they don't want to be preempted in this regard either. I think that's just helpful to us strategically. So I hope we can continue to build those alliances outside of sort of the default lobby for the big four. So thank you.
I completely agree with you.
Okay. Councilmember Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Just thank y'all for being here. This has been a great review. To real quickly return to the monthly report, if it could be requested that the report either have a summary part at the beginning or some way to highlight it, because we got lots of information in the past, but there was so much information, there was no way to know that the thing on page 4 was the really most important thing that we cared about. So if there's some way to bring out, the key issues, and if I think maybe some discussion at the beginning or an opportunity just for us to list what our priorities are would at least let them know what we would like to be looking for. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I think it's also part of the process, and Vice Mayor knows this too, is there's this funnel in the very beginning, right, where you're looking at 1,000 bills, and then as things become clearer, that funnel starts getting a lot narrower. But I hear what you're saying, which is there a way that we can digest for you the main things happening at that time? I do think some of the in-person, like if we do that monthly, that's also a way to say, right now, here are the 2 or 3 things we're most concerned about.
Ms. Hauser, I thought it was the responsibility of the budget chair to condense those 1,000 bills into 5.
Maybe we can write that into the contract.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Evans.
Thank you. Councilwoman Henderson reminded me of this question. So from a lobbyist procurement perspective, will there be a provision in that contractual relationship where they're not lobbying against us on some issues, like Councilwoman Henderson talking about sidewalk robots? Made me think, so we're not getting somebody that's lobbying for us, but then they also work for the sidewalk robot association or something like that.
There are a couple provisions that were in the RFP. There was one that was really a conversation with this council, and the Davidson County delegation that said the lobbyists I'm paraphrasing, the lobbyists cannot be lobbying to take money away from the schools. That was in the RFP. It was actually something that we talked about in our interviews with the candidates based on, we've looked at their client roster and we've had some conversations with them about it. The other piece dealt with conflict of interest and some provisions that give us authority to really be the vetter of that. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but we have a great deal of authority to talk to those, whoever we select, around, they're going to get a client, let's say it is robots on sidewalks, just to make that up, right? That we can say, okay, hold on, what are you going to be advocating for? Is that considered a conflict or not? And there's a provision in the RFP, and I assume that will be in the contract similarly, that gives us some authority on that. Is that accurate?
That's right. And the only addition is we asked them to disclose who else they were registered to lobby for next year, and we have that list, and we're taking that into account in terms of making a selection.
And so as our priorities change or legislative policy priorities change in this body, then it's important that we make sure, I know eventually you all hear about it anyway once it's filed, but if there's something where there could be potentially a concern at the state level, to loop you in on the early side, it sounds like.
Yes, that's great.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions about this one? No, Councilmember Parker.
Thank you. So are there, with a lot of our procurement stuff, it's, you build the sidewalk and that's what we contracted you to do. Like, can you speak to the performance metrics that we would use in a case like this? I mean, I know that it's sort of it's a very dynamic environment and just frankly, like some of the folks that I've heard rumors about being involved in this process are people that, perhaps would maybe make sense if they were extraordinarily effective, but if they were not effective, it would sort of be kind of a lose-lose on both ends for us. So is there can we tie performance metrics to this? Are they successfully?
So I'll tell you what we've talked about, right? We haven't seen what procurement has put together as far as like the contract, but we have discussed having opportunities for evaluation and then opportunities, let's say we're not satisfied, opportunities to amend a contract. So we're looking at ways that we can have some of that accountability so that we don't get into a multi-year contract and we're not satisfied and then it continues, right? We don't want to be in that sort of situation. So we are looking at wording, kind of evaluation, and we revisit the contract. That sort of language is what we've discussed, but we haven't seen that back from procurement yet. And I'll say when we go into an offer situation, my understanding is through procurement, that begins a discussion because this is a little different than you're building a sidewalk. This is a professional service contract. Work could be at 1 a.m, it could be on a Sunday, it could be at 8 a.m. on a Monday. That's the dynamic nature of this kind of contract. So with an award, you go into kind of a negotiation session, and I think that's where we can also get into that evaluation sort of discussion with the vendors.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Anything else on this one? Yeah, Councilmember Vercher.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Can you explain just how the senior advisor, intergovernmental relations or advisor, I forget your official title, how that will now align with a lobbyist?
They'll report to me.
Okay, so we're going to contract out that and they're going to report to you?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Mr. Dietz, Ms. Hauser, thank you all for coming up. Okay. you're welcome to stay. We have a few more items to go over for the executive committee, but we really do appreciate you being here.
Always good to see you.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Come back
Thanks
anytime.
to all of you for the good discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, so a couple things on the agenda. We'll go through the rest of these. These are for just general discussion. These have been picked up from the last meeting. We have a council travel update. So Rosie Hayes have you passed out this sheet of paper? You emailed it. Okay, so it's an email that came out with 2 additional trips. Rosie, I'm going to hit your microphone if you want to grab it. So there was an email that went out that added 2 additional trips to the entire list of approved conferences. You've got that on there. Rosie had also added kind of some general things that people typically might go to. National League of Cities, that's going to be virtual this year. Congressional City Conference, NBC Leo. I think you've got them all laid out, and so you can kind of figure out if you're interested in going. There was also an email that went out that said, obviously, that this year's budget reinstated those funds within the Metro Council budget for authorized travel to council-related educational conferences. Amount is limited to no more than $2,000 per council member. And it has to be approved through the council office, but again, the list that we've got, we can add to. You just have to send the request into Ms. Hayes, and then we just confirm. Councilmember Henderson.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I'm just asking from a practical standpoint, like the National League of Cities, which is coming up. So we understand that, we've got a sustained discounted rate. There's a group discount. Just practically, are we all supposed to individually register for that and then request a reimbursement? And if so, how would we effectuate the group discount? I'm just wondering kind of practically, if I sense, when we all get on a plane and go somewhere, we are so grateful for Rosie's organization of that, right? And everybody kind of has to commit to it. But for something like National League of Cities that we can attend virtually, and, if colleagues want to do so, and, I think those of us who have attended have found kind of the diversity of the programming, the peer city, information that we can get in the policy space. So how many of us are registered for it? How many of us want to go? I sense we're kind of in, I'm going to use a Angieism, a betwixt and between place here where, it's like it's on the horizon. We know it's kind of low cost. It's online. It's easy to do. But I don't sense that any of us are registering because we don't know if we do it individually and get reimbursed. Are we going to do it as a group? I would expect maybe an email that says, who wants to go? Respond to me by this date. I'm going to do it all together in one group thing. And I just wonder if Ms. Hayes could speak to that, just sort of practically, how we're going to get that done. Thank you.
Rosie,
Yes.
I think you should be on. Is it on?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Can you all hear her?
Okay. Due to R12, we cannot do like a group like we used to, like pay for it all at one time. You have to individually pay for it and then get reimbursed. With the group rate with the National League of Cities, 2 years ago, we had one council member to pay for 5 memberships, divided it by those 5, and then they reimbursed that council member. You can then turn around and reimburse yourself through us to get your money back. Does that make sense? We cannot do it like as a group with a card with us. We have to do it individually by council member for it to register your name and your expenses. But what we can do is I can help you through that process, but I cannot do it with Metro. You have to do it yourself. Does that answer your question?
So Metro government cannot avail itself of a group discount when registering Metro employees for an educational opportunity?
No. we can reimburse you individually, but we cannot do it as one group on one card ourselves.
So we'd all have to confer with each other, get together in a group of 6. One of us would have to commit to put onto our personal credit card 6 times $500 or $475. Then I would turn that in. Then you would reimburse me. Then I would disperse that back to 5 colleagues. So effectively, we cannot make the group discount work at all. And we should all just separately on our own credit card register and be reimbursed. Is that correct?
We can make it work if we have 5 that want to go, but I have not received anyone that is interested in participating to the National League of Cities. I have with other trips, but not with the National League of Cities. But if I knew of 5 people coming, I could probably help you with that process, but it will have to be put on somebody's card, and then they pay for it, you reimburse them, and then they can, you can submit it yourself individually and get reimbursed yourself.
Okay.
So let me follow up on Councilmember Henderson's question, so I know what she's talking about. If I know the email has gone out, but if, let's say that 7 people wanted to go, do you know that in advance before anybody starts booking, or can you send out an email to everybody and say, you know, who wants to go to the National League of Cities? Obviously this year it's virtual. And so, and you say by the end of, you know, the close of business on Friday, we need to know. 7 people want to go. There is no way that we can individually figure out that we have 7 so we can take advantage of the discount? Because somebody has to put it on one card. There's no way to do it. There's no way to get in touch with the folks at National League of Cities and say, hey, we're Nashville. We have 40 people on our city council. There are 7 that want to go. We would like to take advantage of the discount and save whatever the amount is, $560.
I mean, I can ask them if they would extend that, but I did not have that. It was not successful a couple of years ago when I did that.
When is so the summit starts in about 2 weeks, correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So when is the registration deadline?
It was in, I think, another week. I'm not sure. I'll have to look at
Another week? So again, following up on what Councilmember Henderson is doing, if we can find out, I think it's probably appropriate to send out an email and say how many people really do want to sign up for this. And if we end up with, give them a specific date, if we end up with more than 5, try to find out if there's some way to get a complimentary just so we save that extra money. That would be good. Okay?
Sure.
Councilmember Henderson, okay with you? Okay. Okay. Any other questions on either the National League of Cities or anything regarding travel? If there are any questions, get in touch with Ms. Hayes. And again, this was allowed in the budget, $2,000. It has to be some type of council educational related trip. Those are the requirements. If there's something that is not on the list that you think is important and relevant, we will take a look at it, and if it qualifies, then we'll add it to the list. Okay? Anything else on this one, Ms. Hayes, that I forgot?
I don't have anything unless someone has any questions for me. I don't mind working with anyone to help them.
Okay. All right. Going on, the next one is translation services, and I think there's a report from Ms. Zeitlin. There, found the right microphone. Okay.
Okay, so we're still continuing to look into translation services. We did get some quotes related to captions, or at least some ballpark figures related to captions. There are several different options, each with varying costs associated with them. So by far the most expensive is for having a personal translation into a different language. It's probably the most accurate, but under the current budget, it is cost prohibitive. It would be close to $300,000, at least according to the quote that we have. The entire translation services budget that was appropriated by the council in this last budget is closer to $50,000 total. There are AI captions. That's currently what Metro uses for English captions on council meetings. That is, I think it was $12 an hour with no minimum time. It is not quite as accurate, but it ends up being approximately $14,000 a year. So for each additional language, it would stay that same price. So if we were to add Spanish translation, that would be an additional $14,000, so a total of $28,000. And then it would be each additional language would be an additional $14,000. And again, that's ballpark because it's per hour. So just kind of as a reminder, Comcast currently does not offer multiple caption capability for Metro Council meetings or MNN. It's likely that Nashville.gov can expand to at least 2 captions, but we're still trying to confirm that. I do want to remind everyone that YouTube has started having translation for captions. It's also seems to be AI technology, so it's not the most accurate, but it translates into several different languages in real time, and that's something that is functional now on the Metro Nashville YouTube page. I've gone back to look at some of our old quotes to just kind of let you all know of the ballpark figures that we're talking about when we're talking about some of these different translation services, but I do want to give a little caveat that these quotes have all expired at this point, so we would need to get updated quotes before making a purchase, so the prices could change. So to have an in-person translator for something like public hearing for individuals who are here to speak at public hearing to translate from a different language into English would be about, I think it was $69 an hour. And I think that came with a 3-hour minimum. So if with that ballpark, $200 to $250 per meeting, assuming that was $250 per meeting, that's $6,000 per year. Translation of written documents. One of the quotes that we had was for translation for Spanish is 18 cents a word. Translation for other languages is 22 cents per word. So to kind of expand that out, for a 500-word document, it would be about $90 to translate into Spanish, $110 to translate into any other languages, and that would be for a single 500-word document. The minimum translation service for this quote was $75 with an additional formatting charge of $50. And then to let you all know what else we're trying to do, we're currently researching peer cities to see what sort of services they offer. I think we've looked specifically so far at Indianapolis and Austin. Those two have seemed to the most common between the cities that we've looked at. It seems to be that they offer services on a case-by-case basis. So if somebody requests a translator, within 48 hours, a translator can be provided. I'm not sure that service is something that we have yet, but we're going to look into whether that sort of, case-by-case translation service would be available to Metro.
Right. Councilmember Porterfield, you were first.
Very quick question. Thank you, Vice Mayor. Is there not a service where if someone shows up, we can just call in and have a translator to provide a on-the-spot service so we don't have to do a request in advance?
Some sort of like a language line, I think that's what we'd be looking into, whether that sort of like language line service would be available to Metro for a meeting like this.
Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Sepulveda.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. So just a couple of things. I think the AI services do fairly well most of the time. We could pretty much understand what's going on, right? It won't be a translation by someone who's a native speaker or has learned the language, but it's pretty understandable. I I think the YouTube stuff being available already, the AI on YouTube is great. My question is, if we had a position within our council office where if we could raise salaries just a little bit for them to be able to help us out when we need last minute translation or help with our newsletters translating that or any graphics, would that be a possibility or something we could look into giving someone maybe even an added raise to be able to provide that service?
That's not something, we've looked into that. That's not something that's traditionally done in Metro. But there's nothing that says that we couldn't do that. One thing that I will say is that we really are looking into using translation services from certified translators just to kind of take that liability off of any one employee just in case there is some sort of mistranslation. So personally, I'm a little more comfortable using a service that was procured through Metro than putting that on an individual employee.
That makes sense as far as the liability aspect of it, but maybe someone could be certified in a language, and if there's a possibility of a staffer. I'm just thinking about costs.
Sure.
And there was one other thing, but I am blanking right now. I at least think that we need to have translation services when we are doing the budget hearing, and it would be great if we could know ahead of time if someone wants to register and come talk at a public hearing for a zoning or whatnot, if they could let us know ahead of time. I think that's a great idea to see if we could try and get some translation services.
So I think you can take all this stuff down. I'm not sure if we're ready to make any decisions. We're just kind of throwing out options. One of the questions, particularly what Councilmember Sepulveda said at the end, so we've obviously had a situation where people have come up and they brought their own translator. That gets into the entire discussion about they're bringing their own translator. We're a Metro government. We're listening. Do we have somebody that we should be providing that is certified so that we're making sure that the information is correct? And that gets into that liability issue. So I think it is something to take a look at. The other question is, I think you're right, particularly during the budget process, if we can get this thing straightened out, I think we should be doing it. What is the feeling about, we're talking about full council meetings, but do we need to be concerned about planning? Because obviously the issues that have come up recently have been around planning. But it's almost entire, if you're trying to talk about all 11 committees, we may never be able to do that. Planning Commission, and which is outside of our scope, but actually we could pass it along. Councilmember Sepulveda, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I think we at least need to take care of our office. I think that we are having a lot of issues with planning. I don't know what the planning's budget is, so maybe that's a conversation that we could have with them. And maybe they could implement something similar where if there's someone that wants to speak on a specific issue, it could be requested. I don't know if that saves money, but I think we at least need to start having some conversations.
Okay. Ms. Eitland, if you don't mind getting in touch with the Planning Commission and
definitely.
see what they do. See
Sure.
if they have they may not have anything at this point. Okay. Councilmember Cash, you're recognized.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. This has been really good information, and I appreciate you looking into this, and hope we move forward and act on some of this. The one thing you quoted was like $69 an hour with a 3-hour minimum. That would come to about $6,000 over the course of a year. Is that for what we're talking about here in terms of like public hearings and public comment, or is that like translating an entire meeting for? What was the?
So that would be for someone to be present to translate from a language into, other than English, into English. And that would be a 3-hour minimum
Right,
at least
okay.
based on this one quote that we have. And then also, I will say, I do think that maybe my math is wrong, because I think I might have done that out for all meetings, but I think that we were thinking just of having it at zoning public hearings, which would just be one meeting a month. So let me real quick grab my calculator
Well,
because I'm not great
that's
at
actually
math.
part of-
Yeah, it'd be $3,000 instead of $6,000.
Okay, well, that's actually part of what I wanted to ask about, because we've got those 12 meetings are, public hearings, but then the other meeting of the month times 12 has public comment period. And I'm wondering, like, we don't always know who's going to come for a public hearing, but people are supposed to sign up for public comment, right?
Right.
And so do we have anything about when they sign up for public comment to ask them if they need a translator? Or I guess I'm thinking that we need to start gathering some information about needs, and that the public comment period, since we have them register for that, I don't know, we don't get tons, so I don't know that we're going to get a lot of information, but it might be a start for kind of putting something up or making sure that we're starting to get in the practice of asking about that.
Yeah, I think we can definitely add something to the public comment form about translation services and whether that's needed now. I will say I'm not sure that we're at a place where we can provide those services yet, but yeah, definitely at least knowing that would be helpful, and then that would help us to be able to know. And I guess kind of to piggyback off of that, if anybody is hearing about any particular language, especially other than Spanish, that your constituents are needing, please let me know, because I was gonna say, we're kind of doing research right now, and we're really focusing on Spanish, but if there's other languages, that would be helpful to know.
Thanks, that's all I have.
All right, I'm going to go back to Councilmember Sepulveda, and then I've got Councilmember Parker after that.
Yes, just piggybacking on what Hannah just said, I think the two main languages that are spoken in Nashville is Arabic and Spanish. But I think that Turk has research, so maybe someone could reach out to Turk. They have research on specific languages that are spoken, and they also do this on a regular basis, so they wouldn't be a bad person, bad group to
great.
reach out to.
Thanks.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Parker.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. So I was curious, in your research, and I'm not super familiar with this feature, but if we were, say, broadcasting live to YouTube, would it be able to have in more or less real time do the AI translation? Because I mean, to me, if that's just like a feature of YouTube that we can take advantage of by broadcasting our meetings live, yes, it's not perfect, but if it gets us in the ballpark for a lot of people, I think that's a huge plus. Also, just on the broader accessibility to meetings question, the mobile, when I go to mnn.nashville.gov, I can almost never get that to load on my phone. So if I'm trying to keep up with a Metro meeting that I'm not present at, I basically can't. There's no audio only feed, and then so I think if it's feasible for ITS to start piping the feeds directly to YouTube Live, and we get translation benefits out of it, accessibility in sort of two spaces there, I think that would be a huge plus. But again, I don't know if they can do that AI translation live. I think
Yeah, I was gonna say, and there's some other questions that are kind of popping into my mind about, like, do we have some sort of like exclusivity contract or something like that? But yeah, I can definitely look into that and see, whether they could be broadcast to YouTube and whether that would, allow for real-time captions.
They broadcast them on Facebook, so I'm pretty sure we
Okay,
could do it on,
all right,
contractually
yeah,
we could
no,
do it on
that's
YouTube as
true.
well. But yeah, if we could look into that, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Welsh, you were making hand gestures. Did you want to be recognized? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. I'm trying to be very expressive with my hand at this
Okay.
time of night. Councilmember Parker made one of the points that I was going to make, that we should avail ourselves of YouTube, especially if that's free. And we can start advertising that like immediately and teach people how to access that so they can get translated. I wondered, is there a way that we can avail ourselves to anything, the translation office at MNPS public schools? Because, they do tons of translation, and they have the list of the 6 major languages that at least are spoken in Metro Public Schools. And they have people on staff who do things. Now, I know some of the documents take, a while to translate, but some of the planning documents or whatever, there's some basic stuff that might be able to be more like plug and paste, that they could more quickly, they might be able to just to turn over some documents fairly quickly, or have access to people who might be able to help us do that more quickly. Because that office is pretty facile if you need help. So they might be able to help us,
Yeah,
or,
we can reach out to NNPS and kind of see.
yeah, see what they have. But Councilmember Parker, as always, stole my thunder. So thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Sorry, next time I'll call on you first before I call on Councilmember Parker. Okay. Anything else on this issue? Will obviously stay on the agenda. Anything else for tonight on this one? All right, let's go to subscription services. Rosie, I'm going to come back to you. All right, so have they got a copy of this one? Okay, so what we had asked Ms. Hayes to do was to go through and try to figure out, based upon different options that were discussed last time, what it would cost to do the Nashville Business Journal, the Tennessean, and the Nashville Post, correct? I think I've got those three. So can you go over kind of the ideas of what you found? Okay.
I called the Nashville Post and the Business Journal, and they gave me prices based on 40 users per year. And because I did a survey several months ago to see who wanted or could use those services, and some of them wanted the paper, some of them already had the paper, some of them said it'd be great. The expense was more than what we have in our budget. We only have $2,000 in there, and that's to cover the Tennessean. We decided to do just one paper for the office. So the Nashville Post, the Tennessean, and the Business Journal. In case you needed something, we could download any articles or whatever. We felt like that was the best price for us at this time. But for 40 users, he said if we were able to do that, that it would be $3,200 a year. And so he also gave me a price that if we do 40, he could do it like if we wanted to prorate it and start it in November and go through June, and then if we decide to not do it that way, a yearly cost. The Business Journal was $3,200. The Nashville Post was $2,760, and then the Tennessean for 1 year for 40 members was $479.52. And so that total was $6,439.52 per year for these papers for 40 subscriptions. So that's where we are.
Any questions about this? Yeah, Councilmember Parker.
Thank you. So one, I could be misremembering this, but is the travel and subscriptions in the same line item?
No, this is just paper subscriptions. Is that what you mean?
Okay, because I was wondering, I know that we are far from utilizing our travel budget, all 40 members utilizing all $2,000, so I didn't know if it was possible to sort of move those funds
It's
around.
broken up into travel is all other, which is like your airline, meals, hotel, and then the other is registration.
Oh.
It's not subscription.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
We're just going to take it out of your clothing allowance.
Okay, fair enough.
All right. Other questions regarding this? I think this is one of those things, so they don't have a copy of this, correct?
No, I can
Okay.
send it to them now.
If you could send this, we'll keep this one on the list as well, take a look at it, and then we'll figure out what we can possibly do. And again, Councilmember Parker's question about can you move funds between things, you're saying, no, we can't do that. And I guess the next question would be, is there any place else? If after reviewing this, the executive committee said, you know what, we'd like to have the Post. We don't want the other two, or we want the Tennessean or whatever. is there money available where we could actually figure out if we could do this or not? Do you want to answer that one? Okay.
I'll answer, but I don't, the answer is I don't know, but we can look into it.
Thank you for answering that.
If you do need any type of an article or anything, you're always welcome to call, and we'll be glad to get it to you. We cut and paste it and can send it to you, whatever you need.
So we had asked, as you know, Elise Waller does kind of a clip service in the morning. We had started that last year. Everybody like that? Is that helpful? Okay, we'll just keep doing that. Okay, so keep this one on the agenda as well. The next item is changes to the rules of procedure. Councilmember Parker had brought up an interesting comment at the last meeting. Councilmember Parker.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. And this is something that I've been thinking about since I joined the body. What I'm wondering is, do we want to revisit the rules around amending legislation on third reading? Currently, I believe it's only Title 17 legislation that can be amended on third reading without a suspension of the rules.
Let me if you want to go ahead and answer, because there's a couple other things that you can actually get an amendment on.
There's a couple other things. I think, hang on, sorry, I have to pull up the rules.
I've got mine here too.
I think it's things like tax incentives.
You can amend the budget on third reading?
I think, yeah, the budget, hang on.
Just to make sure everybody knows what Councilmember Parker is talking about.
41.
This came up at the last meeting. The rules don't allow, as you know, bills to be amended on third reading with certain exceptions. And so I think the question is, what happens if you've got an ordinance on third reading and it's just an amendment, you have to suspend the rules, and sometimes you can't do that. Okay.
The exceptions are zoning matters, budget, revenue service changes, economic development incentive ordinances, or tax ordinances. Those are the exceptions that I'm seeing in Rule 41 as it stands.
Yeah, that's right.
So if I'm, what I wanted to hear from the body this evening is, if we were to open that up to all types of legislation, could be amendable on third without a rule suspension, timely filed amendment without rule suspension, what are the pitfalls there? What are the caveats? What are the issues that could present? And, maybe maybe someone says something that makes me just drop the idea altogether, or maybe there's feedback that will help me craft a good rule change proposal. So if anyone, especially those of you who are second termers or spent more time legislating, Vice Mayor, why would we not do this is maybe the way that I would frame this. Why would we not allow it?
Councilmember Allen.
Thank you. I appreciate the question, and certainly it's a nuisance to just routinely suspend the rules to do it. But I think one value of not being able to change a lot of things on third reading is because when we amend things, even if something is timely filed, we have from Monday afternoon, often until committee meeting, to digest it. And that's, for something substantive, that's not enough time. And I think the suspension of the rules at least gives us a mechanism to slow that process down and keep it from just being something that we automatically do on anything. Maybe there's a way to be able to backtrack it to second reading or something so that we can not have it stymied by somebody just because they're mad at you because you didn't vote for their bill. That's the problem.
Yes.
With depending on the suspension of the rules. But I think there is value to not being able to routinely be able to, work on something for who knows how long. When you finally get to third reading, then you can make a change in the last, 36 hours and be done with it. So if we can think of a way to say you can do it on third reading if you're willing to defer it one more.
That's where my mind was just going as
Great
well.
Great idea. Okay, that's my thought.
So tell me how that would work, Councilmember Parker.
So where my mind was going, and I think Councilmember Allen's mind went there at the same time, is let's say I have legislation on third, and I there's two members that are mad at me, and there's no way I can get it through a rule suspension. if I say I will defer this legislation one meeting in order to be able to, hear this amendment, consider this amendment without a rule suspension, I think that kind of protects and maintains the spirit of what Councilmember Allen is talking about, of not sort of tacking things on with 36 hours notice, but it keeps us from having to rescind previous action and go back to second reading, that would set us back at least 2 meetings, I think, rather than simply one for a deferral in order to consider amendment on third, if that makes sense.
So I was going to say one other thing, and then I was going to start calling on people. I always thought I always was curious about the rule change, but the thing that bothered me was that was the reason for the amendment process to make sure it went through the committee, so that you actually got to review it. And if that was the case, why couldn't you have a process if you're on third and you want to amend, you refer it back to second to get it back to the committee and let them review it, and then it comes back up again. Otherwise, you have to start all over again. But anyway, let me go to Councilmember Withers, and then Councilmember Hancock had her hand up. Oh, okay. Sorry. Councilmember Hancock.
Yeah, I think I like your point even better, Vice Mayor, than the point I was going to make. I agree that I think that when you get something that's late, not timely filed and late, it doesn't give everyone enough time to review it. And that's, I think, why things are sometimes objected to. And even if it was filed by Monday, that's still pretty late. Right now we need to file legislation completed by this Friday in time for the next council meeting. So I would say that would be the same rule that I would like if someone was going to be able to amend something on third, that it be done by this Friday, so that everyone, not just the council members that are voting on it, but all of the constituents across the city, that it's not just blindsiding them, because we got, for this particular legislation you're talking about, we got probably 1,000, but certainly hundreds of emails regarding the legislation as it stood, and then it was changed last minute, and we weren't able to communicate that out to the community, so we couldn't be sure that they would be supportive of this new, vastly different legislation at the last minute. That's why I voted against the last minute rule change, because there's just not enough time. But I do agree it would be cool to be able to bounce back to second. It would also be fine with me if you gave your amendment by, the same deadline as filing legislation, that we would be able to do it at third.
If I could just
Sure.
a direct
Councilmember
response. I'm not interested in allowing late things that are not timely filed special consideration around the rules. The only thing that I'm interested in looking at is timely filed amendment on third, having a pathway to being heard on that legislation that doesn't have to pass the 2-member test, if that makes sense. That doesn't have to pass a rule suspension. So anything that was late filed would still require a rule suspension if any sort of change that I'm talking about were to go into effect.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I just think that it should then either be deferred another meeting to allow it on, or bounce back to second so the committee could review it. I think both of those are great options.
Okay. Councilmember Withers. Oh, okay. Well, you had your hand up first, and then that's why I was coming to you, and then I'll go to Councilmember Henderson.
I have not studied the rules as much as some of my colleagues have, but I think one of the reasons for allowing amendments on third on zoning bills is that the council has a public hearing on second, and we can determine on third whether or not that public commentary was incorporated into an amendment on the final bill. I think that's the reason why you'd have it on third. So, I think ultimately kind of what you sort of take LPRs, for example. Can you imagine going through and having all of this work on second and then still having amendments on third for a very complex piece of legislation, right? I think that is part of the argument for, if you have very complex legislation such as that, you need to keep it on second until you get it to where it pretty much is set, and then everyone gets 2 weeks, to think about that once they kind of know what they're looking at. I think that's the value of keeping bills like that. We know, not all of them would be that complex, but that is the gold standard example of a complex bill. And we have a lot of people speaking to it. So that again kind of speaks to the value of keeping a lot of things like that on second until you're sure that you're ready to move it to third.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Councilmember Henderson?
I was going to concur with Councilman Withers on that. I mean, I think when anticipated, right, when you have a bill of a certain level of complexity and you've amended it, you've substituted, you are kind of holding it back somewhat so that you do have the time for public review and committee. But I mean, I can see and have seen, you know, where good faith, not particularly huge, but you know, it's something that just kind of came up in the late. It's not really housekeeping, but it's not really a huge change. And, you know, with all the work that's been done, it seems very, you know, hard to kind of be in that space. So I would consider or support, if you were going to amend on third, just kind of a deferral by rule. You know, it's just, it defers it one more meeting, so you kind of retain the status of it being on third. You know, that said, you know, I mean, that could include, I guess, a return to committee, and I don't think a return to committee necessarily means it's still on second, right? Because I guess what you're talking about is something that at the time you thought, based on comment, based on committee, it was good to go forward. It did go forward. Something else came up. You need to change it, and not, if you bump it back conceptually, then it's really 2 cycles of meetings that happen. So, I mean, as a former, you know, committee chair, you know, you've got things that are resolution 1 reading, you've got things that are, you know, on second typically, or if you're planning committee, you know, things that really are on third because they've had the public hearing. I don't see this coming up much, so I don't necessarily on a committee agenda if you just had a, you know, a re-referral third reading bill. So, you know, I don't necessarily think it needs both a mandatory referral or a but between the 2 of those, I would say if it goes back to committee, I would not suggest it be on second. But, and or, you know, if you just hold it though, that does allow for more public input, but it doesn't necessarily, you know, give it the committee input. And if it's a technical change or something, you know, it doesn't really seem like rules is kind of the place for that. If it's a subject-specific bill for, you know, public works or otherwise. So I would support, you know, one or the other of those that the body felt was most constructive.
Councilmember Parker, do you want,
I think I agree with like a lot of what's been said, and again, it's great to hear from especially the second termers and third termers in here who have been doing this a lot longer than I have. You know, one thing is when we hold legislation on second, like we're seeing with the 2 LPR bills right now, we hold legislation on second, we have all these amendments, we have all this discussion. What ends up happening is they get indefinitely deferred or withdrawn by rule if we're spending too much time on them. And you know, I think that rule, I don't want to open up another can of worms in the discussion here, but I think that some kind of change, some kind of flexibility on third might allow us, and I certainly think that anything that I would propose will involve a deferral for one, and re-referral to relevant committees or something along those lines, because that's really great feedback. But you know, I guess just the LPR example where it's just things have been. We're looking at, I believe, the Rosenberg sponsored bill is now on track for indefinite deferral, as it was deferred a 3rd time at the last meeting. So I think that process can kind of hang us up when we're leaving things on second for so long. But I have some food for thought here, and I'll chew on this and. Well, that's a consideration. Councilmember Withers just said, you know, remove the limit on deferrals on second, or rather allow a deferral without the indefinite deferral based on a majority vote or something. So rather than having to suspend the rules to do that and 2 people can object and kill it, you just need a majority or something like that. I'm kind of thinking out loud here, so I'll stop talking. It's not super useful for the body.
That's okay. I think I think you've got some good ideas. I think there's some good ideas floating. I think it's, there's reasons why it's there, but there's also, we've run into problems about trying to fix things, excuse me, because a bill is floating on third reading. And then you're trying to figure out how do you get it fixed, or do you have to start all over again? And we don't really want that. We ought to be able to fix it in some way. So we'll leave it on the agenda if that's okay. And,
Thank you. Yeah, and it's largely, I mean, it's because our opportunity to legislate and work is often on the floor. You know, I mean, it's either on the floor or it's in committee. And those opportunities are super limited, so it feels like sometimes we get these just brief little windows to work as a body on legislation, and then they close, and it's just trying to have a little more opportunity there. So thank you all for indulging
no problem.
the discussion.
So it's almost 7. We have 2 other items on, and I meant to mention one other thing under translation services that reminded me. So a number of you all mentioned ADA compliance with when Mr. Sorcy was here last night, and we were trying to figure out exactly how to make that work. So Ms. Eitland had taken that down. She's working through it. Just be aware that we need to address that, okay? So just be aware that we're taking a look at it, and we'll see what we can do. HR research update, Councilmember Syracuse.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I'll try to be brief here, but I'll give a little recap of when this started, which was in the fall of 2019, and I do apologize to you and to the members that this has taken so long. I hope I get a little grace and mercy for 2020. So I did start meetings with members who were interested after I put that email out about what area that they were interested in. The goal here from an HR perspective is that, of course, as we should be, as elected members representing our communities, especially as district council members, we're focused so much on supporting our district, funding our district, that sometimes I think we don't spend a whole lot of time intentionally and strategically thinking about us as a department and all those support services from staff and whatnot that they offer us. And so to try to take a more strategic process here on the ways that we can better support ourselves as a department from an HR perspective or whatnot. The first step was to gather some data so that we can level set and compare us to other bodies. And it's not just local legislative bodies. Since we are the 3rd largest local legislative body, we really needed to look at just like-sized bodies. And so HR helped us pull data across the country. As an example, that one was not a local legislative body. The state of Nebraska is a unicameral government with 49 members, and that's pretty comparable to us. So we have this data now. It's raw data of like legislative bodies, staff members, number of staff members, all this kind of thing. The second piece to this was to survey council members about how they interact with staff, what the needs are, where the needs are not being met, certain things from an IT perspective. Are you aware of certain services that IT offers or whatnot? And so this survey does need to go out. It is ready. And so based on those survey results, when they go out, and one of the things I would ask for from the executive committee is each of your committees try to help me get 100% compliance on the survey. Once that data is taken, matched with the survey results, HR has said that they will assist us in a process of taking all that data and the input from council members and create some business intelligence, if you will, for us to be able to be more strategic about supporting our staff, what kind of positions we could need. I know there's been plenty of talk, as an example, amongst council members that we could use some assistance from a communications person or something like that. Understood and agreed. So that will go out soon. I know this was just specific about HR, but from a broad perspective on this project, the next piece to that was also supporting ourselves from a professional growth development. As soon as we get elected, we're expected to be a fiduciary expert on a $2.5 billion budget. And so from a perspective of a robust, consistent onboarding program, that's one of the aspects of this as well. And it's thanks to council members Allen, Evans, Hauser, and Stiles who got together and put together a structure, if you will. And so that is going to be part of my report that I send to you. That is the survey. And then the third part of of this project has been to really take a look at the second floor of the courthouse here, how we operate, how staff operates, the space that they have. And so the three main aspects to the proposal for what the second floor improvements would be, and huge kudos to Rosie, who has worked very diligently with Metro Clerk staff and General Services and IT. So there's three main components to the improvement to the second floor. The chamber here is not touched, but where Metro 3 is now, just outside of the entranceway to the council office, IT says that they don't really need to be up there anymore, and so they can go downstairs with the rest of the ITS staff. One of the main problems that we have that had really drove this project is that on the first and third Tuesday, this corridor here is way jammed. It's difficult to get into committee rooms. The rooms are not very conducive for us to having good discussion with the people that want to be there. It's not very transparent as far as getting back there. We will recall that then Vice Mayor Briley is the one who had a push to get us cameras in there so that we could actually record our committee rooms. So clerk staff has agreed, in working with Rosie or whatnot, to go to the other side of the floor with a much more improved and intentional layout about how the council office needs to be laid out. Then we have all sorts of room to create 4 much larger tech-oriented committee rooms on this side. So those are the 3 main aspects to that. So I think if we put these 3 things together, this is what I really wanted to be able to achieve about supporting ourselves from a department perspective. And from the HR perspective, that survey does need to go out soon. And the timing is probably good, and I wanted to be able to do this by last year. But if we could get the survey results back, maybe it does come in time for budget process. Because right now, we actually have 3 positions open, as we know. And so, for example, last year during the budget session, we asked for 2 more positions. But it really wasn't done from a strategic perspective about what are these positions going to do. What do we need? What are the services we need? So we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about when we do something like that. So I hope that we can create some sort of process and structure by which, whenever we need to be able to look at things from an HR perspective, we have a better structure in order to go about that. So thanks, Vice Mayor.
Okay. So any questions for Councilmember Syracuse about that? I know Survey will be working on it. It's good to be having strategic analysis of what we're up to, both overall and also structurally. So that's good. Councilmember Allen?
I appreciate the work you're doing. You're gonna keep the break room back here? Just checking, can we still get pizza?
Yes, in fact, it would be a little bit bigger, and then over on the other side would be a little bigger, because then you got 2 departments basically sharing.
Okay.
I thought you told me there was going to be a food
No,
a
we have
food
to have our
court.
place for our pizza on long
that's
nights. So
important.
yes, absolutely.
Priorities.
You told me there was going to be a food court back here. That's what I thought. Yeah. All right. Any other questions regarding this one? All right. The last issue on the agenda is the Civility Committee recommendations. Councilmember Allen, you're recognized.
Thank you. I want to thank Councilmember Withers and Councilmember Johnston for serving on this committee, which the Vice Mayor asked to be put together as one of the special committees. And our task was simply to sort of formalize language that could be kind of an addendum to the council rules, just to spell out, number one, why we even need to talk about a code of civility, and many other cities have those. So we've got some good wherefores in there, just about the need to be able to engage in robust discussions that are fact-based and informative, but not personal. And I think we most often do a good job of that, but every once in a while we get off the rails. and just to be able to point to what the expectations are. So we've looked at kind of 4 or 5 different areas, sort of language and communication, behavior in the chamber, electronic communication, and then accountability. And essentially, it's formalizing what we know we're supposed to do anyway. And we worked very hard to try to put these together in a way that was inclusive and not culturally narrow in any way, particularly with regard to dress and language and things like that. And ultimately, I'm just going to let y'all glance through it. Ultimately, got to the end and said that, you know, if it doesn't make sense to have rules if you don't talk about accountability, and ultimately decided that initially, council members, if we see that there's an issue, it should be in the first place tried to resolve directly between council members just through healthy communication, and short of that, the council executive committee may feel like there's a appropriate role for including a letter of concern or a censure resolution. That would be very extreme. I don't think any of us have risen to the level or gone down to the level that would need that. But we did feel like it was appropriate to say, if we're going to have this, we need to sort of know what the end result is if someone doesn't feel like they need to be respectful of that. And just to follow up on what Councilmember Syracuse said, we did end up with all members of the council and public should always grant each other grace, especially in times of hardship like floods, tornadoes, pandemics, riots, and bombings. Not that any of those things ever happen. So, you know, we should always cut each other slack, and we know that. But I would just welcome the members of this body to look over what we've said, and if it seems appropriate, a lot of thought has gone into this. The committee consisted of current council members and former council members with some great history, you know, several decades and generations of councils. And again, looking at what other cities had done. So I don't think it's anything dramatic, but I would like to suggest that it be added as an addendum or an appendix to the council rules.
Okay. So a couple of questions. Do you want people to take a look at it? We can keep it on the agenda, and when we meet next time, people can bring in comments so you can take a look at it over time. The second thing I'll mention is that there is a rule about decorum in our current rules, but it's talking about bringing food onto the floor. And so it doesn't say anything about just the idea of being courteous and professional to each other and to others. And you all know exactly what I'm talking about. And so when some of these things happen, I went and looked up, and a number of cities have this. It's not saying anything other than the way we should properly act. But we just don't have anything in writing, and that's when the idea of a committee came up, and we asked former council members to be on with current council members to come up with this. So, Councilmember Allen, if it's okay, what we'll do is just let everybody take it home. Councilmember Welsh had made a good point to me at one point, and that was, we've got some traction on some of these things. We need to keep meeting. And so what we'll do is we'll have another one of these things in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll keep these things on the agenda, bring them back, make sure we're comfortable, and then we'll keep talking through this. And if you all have other things you want to add, we'll do it. So I know Councilmember Syracuse has a lot of things that he's been working on over the last 20 or 30 years on this strategic plan, and I'm sure he'd like to share more. But is that okay with you? And then I think we also have to figure out whether it would be addendum to rules or whether we would add it to the rules or what we would do. Okay. Anything on this one or anything else that we need to talk about tonight? Yeah, Councilmember Rutherford.
I do have a question on this, if I may, and I hope I haven't overlooked it because there's a lot of information here, but this deals with decorum inside the chamber. It doesn't really, I wanted to ask if there was anything addressed by the committee in relation to decorum or conduct outside of council activities that might reflect negatively on the body, and how to address that. I see social media is here, but I'm not talking specifically to social media. but anything outside the realm of council duties that reflects negatively on the body. Thank you.
Councilmember Allen?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. And I need to back up and apologize. Councilmember Vercher also served on that committee, and I apologize. I had a senior moment there, so there were 4 of us on that committee. So to address your question, I mean, we began with the statement under language and communication that I think is just, in general, anytime we're representing ourselves as council members, that applies, I think, you know, when we're at a community meeting, when we're at an event as a council member. I mean, the stuff that's within the behavior in the chamber is, you know, is stuff like standing up, speaking to the mayor and that kind of thing. But this first part, language and communication, that is not necessarily restricted to the chamber. But I think it is, well, I'm sorry, it says adjusted chair when speaking during council meetings, but I think always speak respectfully to another council member, staff, and public. Those are, I think, important everywhere. So we've tried to cover both in meetings, through electronic media, and when you're standing in the council chamber. So if that's not clear and we need to clarify that more, then we'll do that. I mean, I think, you know, we are still individuals, and there are times when we are acting totally in our capacity as an individual, but most often when we're out representing Nashville, I think we have an obligation. We worked hard to be the representative of 18 to 20,000 people, and we have a responsibility to do that in a dignified and respectful way. So if that's not clear, then I would welcome suggestions on better verbiage.
Councilmember Rutherford.
I was trying to gear my question more towards the potential for where council members may find themselves in some sort of jeopardy outside of their council activities, and how that behavior or activity could potentially reflect negatively on the whole body, and what the council could potentially do to alleviate that, or to take some sort of action in regards to a council member that may find themselves in that sort of circumstance.
And again, I would say that what our group ultimately came back around to is we felt like the executive committee was a good sub-body of the council to make decisions about things like that. We didn't feel like we wanted to prescriptively say, if a council member does such and such, this is the consequence. We're elected officials, so I mean, we're here. But I mean, I think the executive committee has discretion